My brother announced his engagement at Sunday dinner, and my mother spent the entire toast talking about how my sister-in-law to be deserved someone so accomplished, so driven, so successful. Then she looked across the table at me and said, "And at least one of my children turned out that way." Everyone laughed, including my brother. I didn't say a word. 3 months later, I wrote the check that saved his entire business from collapse, sat across from him at his own kitchen table, and slid the bankruptcy filing across to him so he could read exactly how close he'd come to losing everything and who had quietly made sure he didn't. That dinner was in October. The kind of October where the leaves are perfect and the light is golden and everything looks better than it is. My mother had gone all out for the occasion. Good china. The linen tablecloth she only used for people she wanted to impress. The rosemary focaccia from the Italian bakery 2 towns over. My brother Elliot had brought his fiancée Margot for the first time, and from the moment they walked in the door, my mother transformed into a version of herself I recognized all too well. Softer, more gracious, performing warmth for an audience. Margot was lovely. That's the honest truth. She was a pediatric nurse practitioner with a laugh that filled whatever room she was in, and a genuine ease with people that I immediately envied in the way you envy something you've never been able to fake. She complimented my mother's home without sounding rehearsed. She asked my father about his garden and actually listened to the answer. She was, in every sense, the real thing. My brother Elliot, for his part, was glowing. He'd started his own commercial real estate development company 3 years prior, and it had taken off in a way that my family talked about the way other families talked about winning a championship. He was the story they told at every gathering. He was the proof that they had done something right. And then there was me. I'm a forensic accountant. I know what that sounds like. I know the look people get when I say it at parties, the slight glazing of the eyes, the polite nod, the quick redirect towards someone more interesting. What I do, in plain terms, is follow money. I work with law firms, federal agencies, insurance companies. I find the fraud. I find the hidden assets. I find the trail that someone very smart tried to make disappear, and then I make it visible again. It is, objectively, one of the more quietly consequential jobs a person can have. It is also entirely invisible to people who measure success by how often your name appears on a building. My family had no idea what I actually did. That is not an exaggeration. My mother had told people at our book club that I was some kind of auditor. My father, when pressed, described my work as, "She does taxes but fancier." Elliot had once introduced me at a party as his sister who works in numbers. For years, I had attempted to explain. For years, the explanations had evaporated somewhere between the leaving of my mouth and the entering of their attention. I had eventually stopped trying. So at that October dinner, when Margot turned to me with genuine curiosity and asked what I did, the table did what it always did. It held its breath in a specific way. The way it holds its breath when something slightly uncomfortable is about to be navigated. "Ren does accounting," my mother said, before I could answer. She smiled at Margot in a way that was supposed to look warm and just barely wasn't. "Nothing as exciting as what Elliot does, but she keeps busy." I felt the familiar heat climb my throat. I said quietly, "I'm a forensic accountant. I work mostly with—" "She audits things," Elliot said, refilling his wineglass, not looking up. He said it the way you'd say someone collects stamps, affectionately dismissive. The tone of a man who has never once considered that his sister might be more than a footnote in his own story. Margot looked between us. She had picked up on something. I could see it in the small, careful pause she took before saying, "That actually sounds really interesting." "Like detective work?" "Something like that," I said. "At least one of my children turned out exceptional," my mother said then, raising her glass toward Elliot, and the whole table laughed, and that was that. The conversation moved on. My father made a joke about Elliot's college apartment. Margot told a story about a patient that made everyone tear up in a good way. I ate my focaccia and said very little for the rest of the meal. On the drive home, I didn't cry. I'd stopped crying about my family somewhere around 31. What I felt instead was colder and more clarifying. The specific feeling of watching a pattern confirm itself one more time. I had been the reliable one my entire life. The one who showed up, helped move, remembered birthdays, stayed late at my grandmother's bedside. I was the one who never asked for anything and so was treated as though she needed nothing. I was also, though they didn't know it, the one who had spent the last decade building something quietly extraordinary. 6 weeks after that dinner, Elliot called me. He didn't call to apologize for the toast. He didn't call to check in. He called because his company was in serious trouble and he needed help. I want to be precise about what happened to his business, because precision matters in my line of work. Elliot had taken on a commercial development project in a rapidly growing suburb outside of Charlotte. The deal had looked clean. It wasn't. His project manager, a man he trusted for 2 years, had been systematically skimming from subcontractor payments, creating shell invoices for work that was never performed. The total amount was not small. Combine that with a construction financing structure that was more leveraged than it should have been, and Elliot was staring at a liquidity crisis that had the potential to collapse his entire company within 90 days. He'd found out from his own accountant, a generalist CPA who was good at quarterly filings and not remotely equipped for what he was looking at. His accountant had told him to talk to a lawyer. His lawyer had told him to talk to a forensic accountant. He'd called 3 firms. All of them had quoted timelines of 6 to 8 weeks just to assess the scope. Then he called me. "Ren," he said, and I could hear it immediately, the particular flatness in his voice that meant he was holding something large and trying to keep his hands steady. "I need help. I don't know who else to call." I was in my home office when he called, the one in the condo I owned outright in Raleigh. The condo with the second bedroom converted into a workspace full of filing systems and 2 large monitors and a whiteboard covered in case timelines. The condo my mother had once visited and described as very practical. "Tell me what's happening," I said. He told me. It took 40 minutes. I asked questions throughout, and by the time he finished, I had 3 pages of notes and a fairly clear picture of the damage. "Can you fix it?" he asked. "I can assess it," I said. "I can tell you exactly what happened, document it in a way that's legally defensible, and help you and your attorney figure out what your options are. That's what I do." "How long will that take?" "Faster than 6 weeks," I said. There was a long pause. "Ren, I know I haven't always been—" "Send me everything tonight," I said. "Bank statements, all contracts with the project manager, subcontractor payment records going back 2 years, your financing documents, everything." He sent it by midnight. I want to be honest about why I helped him. It wasn't entirely pure. There was something in me that recognized this moment for what it was. The first time my family had ever needed something that only I could give them. I didn't want his company to fail. I love my brother, in the complicated way you love someone who has spent 20 years being thoughtlessly unkind without ever intending to be cruel. But I also knew, with a clarity I wasn't entirely proud of, that I was going to let him see exactly what he'd been dismissing at dinner tables for a decade. I worked his case the way I work all my cases, methodically, thoroughly, without sentiment. I traced every fraudulent invoice back to its origin. I documented the shell company the project manager had created, identified the 2 accomplices he'd been splitting payments with, and built a paper trail clear enough that a first-year associate could follow it. I also restructured my presentation of his actual company financials in a way that revealed something his own accountant had missed. There was a viable path through this. The company was wounded, not dead. With the right financing bridge and immediate legal action against the project manager, Elliot could recover. The total fraudulent amount was $460,000. My professional fee for the scope of work I performed would normally run between $60,000 and $80,000. I charged him $40,000, not as a gift, as a deliberate choice I made with full awareness of what I was doing. When the work was done, I called him. "I need you to come to my office," I said. "Bring whoever you want. Your attorney, your accountant, your fiancée if you want. This is gonna take a couple of hours. Can't you just send it?" "No," I said. "Come in person." I also, separately, called my mother. This part requires some explanation. In the weeks while I'd been working Elliot's case, I'd learned something from his financial records that had nothing to do with the fraud. Elliot had been receiving informal loans from my parents for years. Not large amounts individually, but they added up. Seed money when he started the company. A short bridge when a deal took longer than expected. My parents had given him, over 5 years, just over $90,000, all of it off the books, none of it documented as anything other than family support. I had known none of this. I was never offered any. I had paid my own way through 2 graduate programs, taken on my own debt, built my own firm without a single dollar of family capital. Not because I was too proud to ask, but because it had never once been offered. The money had flowed to Elliot as naturally as water finding its level, invisible and assumed, because he was the one building something visible. I didn't confront anyone about this. I filed it away. But it informed what I did next. I called my mother and said, "I'd love for you and Dad to come by Elliot's office with me on Thursday. I have some good news about his situation, and I think it would mean a lot to him to have everyone there." She agreed immediately without asking a single question about how I'd been involved or what I'd done. That told me everything. Thursday morning, Elliot's office. Conference room on the 3rd floor with big windows that looked out over a small lake. His attorney was there. A sharp woman named Patricia, though not the Patricia from any other story. This one wore reading glasses on a beaded chain and had the quiet authority of someone who has seen most things twice. Elliot's CPA. Elliot and Margot, who had insisted on coming. And my parents, my mother in her good blazer, my father looking uncertain, both of them still not entirely sure why they'd been asked. I set the report on the table. It was bound. 41 pages plus appendices. "I'm going to walk you through what I found," I said, "and then I'm going to walk you through what comes next." I did. I went through the fraud systematically, clearly, without drama. I watched Elliot's attorney take notes in a way that told me she was satisfied with the documentation. I watched Elliot himself move through something I recognized, the specific passage from disbelief to comprehension to the first fragile stirrings of relief. At the end, I placed a second document on a table. It was a single page. "This," I said, looking at Elliot, "is the bankruptcy filing that your previous accountant was preparing to recommend. He hadn't shown it to you yet. I found it in the documents you sent me." Elliot went still. "You were 11 days from being advised to file Chapter 7, I said. "That would have dissolved the company. The recovery path I've outlined is viable, but it required someone who could read what was actually happening in the financials, not someone who does quarterly filings." I slid the bankruptcy document across the table toward him. He looked at it for a long time. Then he looked at me. "Ren," he said. His voice had gone quiet in a way I hadn't heard from him before. "How did you—" "This is what I do," I said. I said it without edge, without performance. Just the plain fact of it. This is what I've always done. You just never knew what it looked like. My mother was very still at the end of the table. She was looking at the bound report with my firm's name on the cover, looking at the attorney who was nodding with professional respect, looking at her son's face, which was doing something she hadn't expected it to do in her presence. "I want to clarify something for everyone in this room," I said, and I looked at my mother when I said it. "I was never some kind of auditor. I was never just doing numbers. I run a forensic accounting practice. I've worked federal fraud cases. I've testified as an expert witness in 3 states. I've built something quietly over 10 years, and the reason you didn't know is because you never asked." The room was quiet. "Elliot asked," I said, "so I hoped." My mother opened her mouth, closed it. She had the look of a woman who has just seen a building she thought was a vacant lot reveal itself as a skyscraper. The math of her assumptions was reorganizing itself in real time, and the calculation was not coming out in her favor. Margot, from her seat beside Elliot, said quietly, "Thank you, Ren." It was the only thing that landed cleanly that morning. I nodded at her. The aftermath was slower than I expected and pettier than I should have been surprised by. My mother called me that evening, not to apologize, to ask why I hadn't led with what I do professionally when Margot had asked me at dinner. "It would have been nice for us to know," she said, which was the most extraordinary reframing of years of willful incuriosity I had ever heard. "Mom," I said, "you told your book club I did taxes. I tried to explain my job to you and Dad no fewer than a dozen times over the past 10 years. At some point, the question isn't why I stopped explaining. It's why you stopped listening. She went quiet. The dinner, I said. The toast. The at least one of my children turned out exceptional. That was in front of his fiancée, in front of someone who'd never met me before. That was a choice you made. I was celebrating your brother, you were diminishing me, I said. There's a difference. You can do both things at once, and one of them doesn't cancel out the other. She said she didn't appreciate my tone. I said I didn't appreciate a decade of being described as someone who keeps busy. We didn't speak for 3 weeks after that. Elliot called me 4 days after the conference room meeting. His attorney had moved immediately. The project manager had been served. There was a credible case for civil recovery and potentially criminal charges. The financing bridge I'd outlined was already in preliminary conversations with 2 lenders who specialized in distressed commercial real estate situations. It was going to be hard, but it was going to be survivable. I owe you, he said. And I don't just mean the fee. You don't owe me anything, I said, but I'd like you to understand something. The way you introduced me at that party 2 years ago, your sister who works in numbers, the way you let Mom do the talking at dinner last month. I know it feels small to you. It doesn't feel small to me. He was quiet for a moment. I know, he said. I've been thinking about that. A lot, actually. Good, I said. Can I ask you something? He said. Did you know about the bankruptcy filing before you came in? Did you plan that? Yes, I said. Another pause. Was it? Did you bring Mom and Dad because you wanted them to see? I considered being diplomatic. Yes, I said. I wanted them to see. He exhaled slowly. Okay, he said. I think I would have done the same thing. That was the most honest conversation I'd had with my brother in 15 years. We got off the phone and I sat in my home office for a while, looking at the whiteboard, thinking about the strange arithmetic of families. How they assign value early and rarely revise. How the quiet child becomes invisible, not through any act of her own, but through the collective laziness of people who prefer a settled story. The 3 weeks of silence with my mother broke when she called to tell me she'd been diagnosed with early-stage plantar fasciitis. Classic misdirection. The injury is olive branch. I drove down to see her because that is what I do. I show up. We didn't discuss the dinner or the toast or the conference room. We watched 2 episodes of a show she liked, and I made her the kind of tea she preferred. And when I left, she held my hand for a moment longer than usual. It wasn't an apology. It was my mother's version of one, which is the only version she has ever been capable of. I have learned slowly to accept the version available rather than wait for the one I wanted. My father called separately the following week. He is a man who processes things late and privately and expresses them badly but sincerely. Your mother told me what you said on the phone, he said, about explaining your job, about us not listening. He paused. She didn't tell me the specifics, but I think she was right that you said it. I think we've been... Another pause. Longer. I think we haven't paid attention the way we should have. To you. No, I said. You haven't. I'm sorry for that, he said. It is a strange thing to receive a real apology from a parent in your 30s. Strange enough that it took me a beat to say anything back. Thank you, Dad, I said finally. That matters. And it did. It wasn't everything. But it mattered. Elliot's company survived. The civil suit against the project manager settled 14 months later for an amount that covered the majority of the fraud losses. The company restructured, brought in tighter financial controls, and within 18 months was profitable again. Elliot sent me a referral, a developer friend of his who needed exactly my kind of work, and that referral led to 3 more. He introduced me at a dinner, about 6 months after the conference room, as my sister, who runs a forensic accounting practice and is genuinely one of the best at what she does. I noticed that he said it like he'd been practicing. Maybe he had. Margot and I have a text thread now. She sends me articles about financial fraud cases in the news, and I sent her ones about interesting medical ethics situations, and neither of us explains why. It started the week after the conference room meeting, and neither of us has acknowledged it directly. I like her enormously. My mother came to see the office eventually. I showed her the certifications on the wall, the case files in the locked cabinets, the corner with the second monitor dedicated to whatever federal case I was supporting at any given time. She walked through it slowly, touching nothing, taking it in. She didn't say much. At one point, she stopped in front of a framed copy of an article from a trade journal that had profiled my work on a major insurance fraud case 2 years before. I didn't know about this, she said. No, I said. You didn't. She looked at it for a long time. You're very good at this, she said finally. It wasn't effusive. It wasn't the apology I had wanted for decades. It was just her reading the room and telling the truth, possibly for the first time about something that mattered to her less than it should have. Yes, I said. I am. We went to lunch after. She told me about her book club. I told her about a case I was working on. The broad strokes, nothing confidential. She asked questions, real ones, that required actual answers. It was, I thought, a beginning. Not a reconciliation. Not a resolution. A beginning. I drove home with the windows down, the October air doing what October air does in the Carolinas, warm and sharp all at once. I thought about Elliot across that conference table, reading the bankruptcy filing with his name on it. I thought about the look on my mother's face when the attorney nodded. I thought about my father saying, "I think we haven't paid attention the way we should have," and meaning it, and the strange mercy in a late apology that is better than none. I had built something real. I had built it quietly in the way that serious things get built, with time and precision and without an audience. And it had turned out that when the audience finally arrived, what they found was already finished. I had, as my mother once said I never would, figured things out. I'd just done it in a room she hadn't thought to look in. The thing about being underestimated for a long time is that it stops feeling like an insult and starts feeling like weather. You just dress for it. You stop expecting it to change, and you build your life in whatever light gets through. I built mine in a quiet room with 2 monitors and a whiteboard and cases that mattered to people who needed them solved. I didn't announce it. I didn't need to. The work was real whether or not anyone in my family understood what it was. What I've come to believe, and what Elliot's situation made undeniable, is that integrity is not a performance. It is not something you demonstrate when people are watching. It's what you do with the 41-page report when you could have charged double and no one would have questioned it. It's what you do when you're working the case of someone who laughed at you 2 months prior, and you work it just as carefully as you would for anyone else, because the work deserves that, because you deserve that, because cutting corners to punish someone is still cutting corners. I charged Elliot less than my standard rate, not because I was being soft, because I made a deliberate ethical choice about what kind of professional I am, regardless of what my family had done. The outcome of that choice, what it communicated in that conference room, was simply the truth, revealing itself at the right moment. That is how integrity tends to work. Quietly, and then all at once. And the intelligence it took to get there wasn't the kind you're born with. It was the kind you build. I spent years learning how money moves when someone is trying to hide it. I spent years developing the kind of reading, the kind of pattern recognition that allowed me to find in Elliot's files something his own accountant had missed. That came from choosing to take my craft seriously even when no one around me took it seriously. Even when the people who were supposed to be proud of me were describing it as taxes but fancier. You can let that diminish you, or you can let it clarify you. I let it clarify me. I kept studying. I kept building. I kept going into rooms where I was the only person who knew what I actually knew, and I did the work anyway. The third thing is harder to name, but I felt it every time I sat back down at that desk after a difficult phone call with my mother. It is the particular endurance required to stay in motion when the people closest to you do not believe in what you are building. It is not stubbornness. Stubbornness is rigid. This is more like roots. You keep growing not to prove anything to anyone but because stopping would mean becoming someone you can't respect. I had a choice every single year of my career to make myself smaller, to pick something my family could understand and explain at a dinner party. I chose not to. That choice cost me something real. The easy belonging, the uncomplicated Thanksgiving. But it gave me the room I was standing in when Elliot needed someone who knew what she was doing. None of this erased what hurt. My mother's toast still happened. The years of not asking still happened. But I have found, on the other side of all of it, that consequences are honest in a way that people rarely are. What you build with integrity, intelligence, and the refusal to quit eventually becomes visible. Not because you forced it, but because real things, when the light finally hits them, are simply there. I had figured things out. I'd just done it in a room they hadn't thought to look in.